we all want to feel safe. When we buy a house, the very first thing we do is figure out how to keep the outside world from getting in. We install heavy deadbolts on the doors. We put reinforced glass in the windows. And in today's modern world, we go even further. We buy smart locks. We install high-definition Wi-Fi cameras in our living rooms, our kitchens, and our hallways. We put smart speakers on our nightstands so we can control our entire fortress with just the sound of our voice. We do all of this to build a wall between ourselves and the monsters outside. But we never stop to ask a very simple, terrifying question. What if the locks and cameras we buy to keep the monsters out are the exact same tools they use to get inside? Welcome to the Safe House Illusion. Over the next hour, you are going to hear for true, documented stories of people who realized that the walls of their homes could not protect them. We will journey through the physical horrors of intruders hiding in the dark corners of the attic, to the psychological terror of the unseen watcher. But we begin our journey not in a dusty old basement, but in a bright, modern, highly connected home. A home where the ghost haunting the halls was not made of ectoplasm, but of thousands of lines of malicious code. This is Chapter 1, The Digital Poltergeist. It was a freezing cold September in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The kind of cold that bites at your skin the moment you step outside. For Samantha and Lamont, their home was their ultimate sanctuary against the bitter weather. They had recently spent a significant amount of money upgrading their house into a fully integrated smart home. They bought a top-of-the-line Google Nest system. They had a smart thermostat to keep the house warm. They had a smart doorbell to see who was outside. And they had a high-definition indoor camera mounted on the wall in their kitchen, giving them a full view of the main living area. Everything was connected to their home Wi-Fi network. Everything was controlled from an app on their smartphones. It was convenient, it was modern, and most importantly, it made them feel incredibly secure. It was a normal Tuesday afternoon. Samantha and Lamont had just finished work and were relaxing in their living room. The house was quiet, but then Samantha noticed that she was sweating. The air inside the living room felt thick and suffocatingly hot. She walked over to the digital thermostat mounted on the hallway wall. She looked at the glowing screen and frowned. The temperature was set to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Samantha was confused. She never set the heat that high. She assumed she must have accidentally bumped the dial, or perhaps the app on her phone had glitched. She manually turned the dial back down to a comfortable 70 degrees, went back to the living room, and sat down. 5 minutes later, she felt a bead of sweat drip down the side of her face. The heat was radiating from the vents. It felt like an oven. She walked back to the hallway. The thermostat was glowing brightly. It was back up to 90 degrees. A deep feeling of unease settled in Samantha's stomach. A thermostat doesn't just turn itself back up. She called Lamont over. Lamont, being a logical man, assumed the smart device was malfunctioning. He opened his phone app, went into the settings, and turned the temperature down again. He watched the screen on the wall to make sure it synced. It did. The number dropped to 70. They stood there for a few seconds, waiting. Right in front of their eyes, the digital numbers on the screen began to climb. 75, 80, 85, 90. Someone or something was fighting them for control of their own house. Before Lamont could even speak, a sound ripped through the silence of the house. It was music, extremely loud, aggressive, vulgar music blasting at maximum volume. Samantha jumped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The music wasn't coming from their television. It wasn't coming from their phones. It was coming from the tiny speaker built into the indoor security camera mounted on the kitchen wall. Lamont immediately walked into the kitchen, staring up at the white, dome-shaped camera. The music was deafening. He reached up to unplug it from the wall socket. But as his hand got close to the wire, the music abruptly stopped. The house was plunged back into a suffocating 90-degree silence. Lamont slowly lowered his hand. He looked back at Samantha, who was standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. And then they heard it. It wasn't music this time. It was a voice, a man's voice, crackling through the tiny speaker of the security camera. The voice was distorted, deep, and incredibly calm. The voice said, "I can see you." Samantha felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped backward. The camera mounted on the wall was a pan and tilt model. It had a small mechanical motor inside that allowed it to rotate and follow movement. In the dead silence of the hot kitchen, Samantha and Lamont heard the soft mechanical whirring sound of the camera motor. They watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as the lens of the camera physically moved. It slowly rotated on its mount, turning away from the living room and pointing directly at Samantha. The lens stopped. It stared right at her. A small red LED light above the lens blinked on, indicating that it was actively recording. The voice crackled through the speaker again. "I see you standing there," the man whispered. This was not a glitch. This was not an automated error. There was a living, breathing human being sitting behind a computer screen somewhere in the world. Handy was inside their house. He was watching them in real time. He was controlling their environment. He had turned their safe haven into a terrifying digital prison, and he was playing with them like a cat playing with a mouse. Panic overtook logic. Lamont didn't try to use the app. He didn't try to reason with the voice. He lunged forward, grabbed the power cord of the camera, and ripped it violently from the electrical socket. The red light died. The camera slumped downward. Lamont didn't stop there. He ran to the hallway, grabbed the internet router, and pulled the main power cable. He completely killed the Wi-Fi network for the entire house. The smart thermostat went dark. The house was completely disconnected from the outside world. Samantha and Lamont stood in the dark, suffocating heat of their living room, breathing heavily. They had stopped the intruder, but the feeling of violation was overwhelming. They called the police. They contacted the manufacturer of the smart devices. What they learned over the next few days was a terrifying wake-up call about the reality of modern technology. The hacker didn't use some incredibly sophisticated, impossible-to-stop cyber attack. He didn't break through military-grade encryption. He used a list of compromised passwords he found on the dark web. Samantha and Lamont had made the most common mistake in the digital age. They had used the same password for their smart home account that they had used for an old, forgotten website years ago. When that old website was hacked, their password was leaked. The intruder simply bought that list, found their email address, and logged in. He had full access to everything. He knew when they were home. He knew when they were asleep. He could have unlocked their front door at 3 in the morning and invited anyone he wanted inside. Samantha and Lamont changed their passwords. They enabled two-factor authentication. They upgraded their network security. But the psychological damage was already done. They could not look at the camera on the wall without feeling a cold shiver down their spine. They could not hear the heat turn on without wondering if someone else was controlling it. They eventually uninstalled the indoor cameras completely. They realized that the peace of mind they thought they were buying was nothing more than an illusion. We invite these digital eyes and ears into our most intimate spaces. We place cameras in our bedrooms to watch our sleeping children. We put microphones on our kitchen counters, but a camera does not know who its master is. It only knows who has the password. If you have a camera in your house right now, take a good look at the lens. Look at the little red light. Are you absolutely sure that you are the only one watching? The digital poltergeist is terrifying because it invades our privacy without ever leaving a footprint. But what happens when the intruder isn't thousands of miles away behind a computer screen? What happens when the person watching you sleep is standing in the very same room, breathing the very same air, and you don't even know it? When we return in Chapter 2, we will explore a physical horror so deeply disturbing, it will make you want to check the locks on your doors twice. The story of a man who didn't want to steal from you. He just wanted to stand in the dark and listen to you breathe. Welcome back. In our first chapter, we explored the terror of the unseen digital watcher. The feeling of being violated by someone thousands of miles away. But as terrifying as a hacked camera is, you can always pull the plug. You can always turn off the router. You can always walk out of the camera's view. But what happens when the intruder isn't trapped behind a screen? What happens when you pull the blanket up to your chin, close your eyes, and slowly realize that the sound of breathing in the room isn't yours? This is Chapter 2, The Teacup Trick. Our bedrooms are supposed to be our ultimate safe space. It is the one room in the house where we are completely, physically vulnerable. We change our clothes there. We sleep there. We surrender our consciousness to the dark for 8 hours every single night, trusting that the locks on our front doors will hold. But in the late 1970s, a string of incredibly bizarre and deeply disturbing home invasions occurred in a quiet, affluent neighborhood in California. The police were completely baffled, not because of what was stolen, but because of what was left behind. These were not normal burglaries. The intruder was not looking for cash. He was not looking for jewelry. He was looking for a psychological thrill. He wanted total control over a sleeping human being. Our story focuses on a young woman named Claire. Claire lived alone in a single-story ranch house. She was a light sleeper, always making sure every window was locked and the deadbolt was turned before she went to bed. It was a Tuesday night in November. The weather was unusually cold. Claire had checked the locks, turned off all the lights in the house, and crawled into her bed around 11:30. The house was dead silent. Within 20 minutes, she fell into a deep sleep. Around 3 in the morning, Claire slowly began to wake up. It wasn't a sudden jolt. It was a slow, groggy realization that she was no longer asleep. The room was pitch black. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness, but there was no moonlight coming through the heavy curtains. Claire felt a strange, heavy pressure on her chest. It felt exactly like sleep paralysis. She tried to take a deep breath, but her chest felt restricted. She tried to move her left arm, but her brain screamed at her to stop. Something was wrong. As she lay there on her back, staring up at the dark ceiling, she heard a sound. It was a soft, delicate, clinking sound, like 2 pieces of fine china gently tapping against each other. The sound came from directly on top of her dot. Claire froze. Her heart began to race, pounding violently against her ribs. Every survival instinct she possessed was telling her to jump out of bed, to run, to scream. But an overwhelming, paralyzing fear kept her pinned to the mattress. She slowly, carefully lowered her chin to look down at her own chest in the dark. Sitting perfectly balanced on the center of her blanket, directly over her heart, were 2 ceramic teacups. One was stacked upside down on top of the other. Claire couldn't breathe. She couldn't comprehend what she was looking at. She lived alone. She had gone to sleep with nothing on her bed. How did 2 teacups get onto her chest while she was sleeping? And then a second sound broke the absolute silence of the bedroom. It came from the far corner of the room, near her closet door. It was a sound that instantly turned the blood in Claire's veins to ice. It was the sound of a slow, heavy exhale. Someone was standing in the pitch-black corner of her bedroom. Claire's eyes darted toward the sound. In the deep shadows, she could barely make out the silhouette of a tall man leaning against the wall. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was just standing there, watching her sleep. The terrifying reality of the situation washed over Claire. The intruder had broken into her house. He had walked quietly into her bedroom while she was completely unconscious. He had gone into her kitchen, taken 2 teacups from her cupboard, and brought them into the bedroom. He had stood over her sleeping body, close enough to feel her breath on his hands, and he had carefully, meticulously balanced those 2 teacups directly on her chest. It was a sick, twisted, psychological game. The teacups were a crude alarm system. The intruder wanted to stand in the dark and watch her, but he wanted to know the exact second she woke up. He knew that if she woke up and tried to sit up, or if she tried to reach for the telephone on her nightstand, the teacups would fall and clatter against each other. The sound of the porcelain would be his signal. Claire was trapped. If she moved, the cups would fall. If she screamed, he would cross a room in 2 seconds. She lay perfectly still. The only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the tall man in the corner and the rapid, terrifying beating of her own heart. Tears began to stream down Claire's face, soaking into her pillow. She squeezed her eyes shut, silently praying that he would just take whatever he wanted and leave. Minute after agonizing minute passed, it felt like hours. Every time Claire took a slightly deeper breath, the ceramic cups on her chest shifted, making a tiny, terrifying clink. And every time the cups made a sound, the breathing from the corner of the room would stop. He was listening. He was waiting for her to make a move. Claire was experiencing the absolute peak of human terror. She was a hostage in her own bed, completely paralyzed by a stack of kitchen dishes. After what felt like an eternity, the man in the corner finally moved. Claire heard the soft rustle of clothing. She heard the faint creak of the floorboards as he slowly stepped away from the wall. He didn't walk toward the bed. He walked backward, slipping silently out of the bedroom door and into the dark hallway. Claire lay there, rigid as a board. She didn't dare to move. She listened as the floorboards creaked down the hallway, into the living room, and finally, she heard the soft click of her back door gently closing shut. He was gone. Claire waited another full 10 minutes before she finally found the courage to move. She slowly slid her hand up her chest, grabbed the 2 teacups, and threw them onto the floor. They shattered into dozens of pieces. She lunged for the phone, dialed 911, and locked herself inside her master bathroom until the police arrived. When the police searched the house, They found no forced entry. The intruder had picked the lock on the back door with professional skill. Nothing in the house was stolen. Her purse was still on the kitchen counter. Her jewelry was untouched. The only things out of place were the broken teacups on the bedroom floor. The detective working the case told Claire something that she would never forget for the rest of her life. He told her that she was not the first victim. This specific intruder was known to the local police. He was a serial stalker who derived sexual thrill and psychological dominance from breaking into women's homes and watching them sleep. He used the teacup trick to maintain absolute control over his victims without ever having to touch them. The detective told Claire that she had done exactly the right thing by not moving. He told her that the previous women who had panicked, who had caused the cups to fall and shatter in the dark, had suffered a much more violent fate. The man was never caught. He simply vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a trail of traumatized victims who would never feel safe in their own beds again. Claire moved out of that house a week later. She never lived alone again. She bought a large dog, and she installed 3 different heavy-duty locks on her bedroom door. But even years later, whenever she stayed in a hotel or slept in a new place, she would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night. She would lie perfectly still in the dark, her heart racing, waiting to hear the soft clink of porcelain and the heavy sound of someone breathing in the corner of the room. We lock our doors to keep the monsters outside, but the most terrifying monsters are the ones who don't want to hurt your body. They want to break your mind. If you wake up tonight and feel a strange pressure on your chest, do not sit up right away. Do not turn on the lights. Just listen, because sometimes the shadows in the corner of your room are not just shadows. We have explored the hacker in the camera and the stalker in the dark, but both of those intruders eventually left. What happens when the monster breaks into your house and decides he never wants to leave? When we return in Chapter 3, we will descend into the ultimate home invasion nightmare, the true story of a family who thought their house was haunted, until they found out what was really hiding behind their bathroom mirror. Welcome back. In our first 2 chapters, we explored the terrifying realities of the digital watcher and the silent stalker in the dark. Both of those intruders violated the sanctity of the home, but eventually they left. The hacker disconnected. The stalker walked out the back door. But what happens when the monster breaks into your house and decides that he never wants to leave? What happens when the stranger doesn't just visit your home, but secretly moves into it? This is Chapter 3, The Boy Behind the Mirror. In the winter of 1986, a man named Brian lived in a modest 2-story house in Pepperell, Massachusetts, with his 2 teenage daughters. It was a quiet, typical American family home. But shortly after the new year, the atmosphere inside the house began to change. It started with small, unexplainable events. The girls would come home from school and find the television turned on, playing a channel they never watched. Brian would go to the kitchen to make coffee in the morning and find a milk carton completely empty, even though he had just bought it the day before. Then the events became more physical. Furniture was found moved inches away from the walls. Doors that were locked at night would be found standing wide open in the morning. The family would hear the faint, muffled sound of a toilet flushing in the middle of the night. But when they checked the bathrooms, they were completely empty. The two teenage girls naturally assumed the house was haunted. They thought a ghost was playing tricks on them. But Brian was a practical man. He didn't believe in the supernatural. He told his daughters they were just being forgetful, or perhaps playing a prank on each other to get attention. But the haunting did not stop. It escalated into pure psychological warfare. One afternoon, the girls came home from school to an empty house. They walked into the basement to do laundry. As they reached the bottom of the wooden stairs, they froze. Written on the concrete wall of the basement in large, dripping red letters was a message. It looked like blood, but it was actually ketchup stolen from their own refrigerator. The message read, "I am in your room. Come find me." The girls screamed and ran out of the house, calling their father. When Brian arrived, he was furious. He still believed it was a sick joke played by one of the neighborhood kids. He washed the wall, checked the locks, and told the girls to calm down. But the fear had permanently settled into the bones of the house. The family felt like they were constantly being watched. They felt a heavy, oppressive energy in the hallways. They stopped sleeping through the night. A few weeks later, the terrifying truth finally revealed itself. It was a cold evening. Brian was at work, and the two girls were home alone, sitting in the living room, watching a movie. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the television. Suddenly, they heard a strange, rhythmic tapping sound. It was coming from the upstairs bathroom. Tap, dot, tap. Tap, dot. The girls muted the television. They sat perfectly still on the couch, terrified. The tapping continued, followed by a soft, dragging noise against the floorboards. Armed with a heavy flashlight and a baseball bat, the older sister slowly crept up the wooden stairs. Her heart was pounding in her throat. She walked down the dark hallway and stood outside the closed bathroom door. The dragging sound was coming from inside. She took a deep breath, grabbed the doorknob, and violently threw the door open, shining the flashlight into the room. The bathroom was empty. The shower curtain was pulled back. There was no one there. She let out a shaky breath, thinking her mind was playing tricks on her. But as she turned around to leave, she caught a glimpse of something in the large vanity mirror above the sink. The mirror was mounted to the wall, but it looked slightly crooked, and from behind the edge of the mirror, a faint sliver of absolute darkness was visible. She walked closer to the sink. She leaned in, staring at the small gap between the mirror and the wall. And then, a pair of human eyes blinked back at her from the darkness. Someone was standing inside the wall, looking out through the crack behind the mirror. The girl screamed a blood-curdling scream, dropped the flashlight, and ran for her life. She grabbed her sister, sprinted out the front door into the freezing night, and ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. When the local police arrived, they drew their weapons and carefully entered the home. They walked upstairs and went into the bathroom. They saw the crooked mirror. An officer reached out and pulled the mirror away from the wall. It wasn't just a mirror. It was a cleverly disguised door that led to a narrow, dark crawl space hidden between the walls of the house. The officers shined their flashlight into the dusty, cramped space. Sitting in the darkness, backed into a corner, was a 16-year-old boy. His name was Daniel. He was dressed in filthy, ragged clothes. His face was covered in dark dirt and paint, and resting on his lap was a heavy, sharp hatchet. The police dragged him out of the wall and arrested him. The investigation that followed uncovered a reality that was infinitely more horrifying than any ghost story. Daniel had not broken into the house that day. He had been living inside the walls of the family's home for nearly 2 months. He had created a small, secret living space in the narrow gaps between the drywall and the plumbing. He slept in the insulation. He used a bucket as a toilet. During the day, when the family was at school and work, he would come out. He would eat their food, watch their television, and walk through their bedrooms. But the most terrifying part was what he did at night. When the family was asleep, Daniel would creep out of the walls and stand in their bedrooms. He would watch the girls sleep. He was the one who moved the furniture. He was the one who wrote the message in ketchup. He listened to their conversations through the thin drywall. He knew everything about them. He had complete access to their lives, and he used that access to systematically terrorize them from the shadows. The family immediately moved out of the house. The psychological trauma of knowing that a stranger with a hatchet had been sleeping inches away from them on the other side of the bedroom wall was too much to bear. We check under our beds. We look inside our closets before we go to sleep. We do this to assure ourselves that our bedrooms are empty. But the story of the boy behind the mirror forces us to look at our homes differently. It forces us to look at the blank, empty walls of our houses and wonder about the dark. Hollow spaces hiding just a few inches behind the paint. Tonight, if you hear a soft scratching sound coming from the wall next to your bed, do not assume it is just a mouse, because sometimes the walls have eyes. We have faced the hacker, the stalker, and the frogger. But our final story is perhaps the most chilling of them all. Because in our fourth and final chapter, the monster doesn't hide in the dark. The monster walks right up to your front door and leaves a message that proves you have never, ever been safe. Stay tuned for the terrifying conclusion in Chapter 4. Welcome to our fourth and final chapter. Over the past 45 minutes, we have explored the horrors that break into our homes. We have seen the hacker who watches through the camera lens. We have felt the breath of the stalker in the dark bedroom. And we have discovered the hidden Phrogging living silently behind the drywall. In all of those stories, the terrifying reality was discovered. The intruder was eventually exposed, and the victims could finally begin to heal. But our final story is different. It is the ultimate psychological nightmare. Because in this story, the monster doesn't hide in your attic. The monster doesn't hack your Wi-Fi. The monster stands outside in the broad daylight, watching your every move, and slowly destroying your life with a pen and a piece of paper. And the most terrifying part of all, this monster was never caught. This is Chapter 4, The Westfield Watcher. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria bought their absolute dream home. It was a massive, beautiful, 6-bedroom house located at 657 Boulevard in the incredibly safe, wealthy town of Westfield, New Jersey. They paid over $1.3 million for it. It was the perfect place to raise their 3 young children. Before moving in, Derek and Maria decided to do some renovations. The house was empty, filled only with painters and contractors during the day. One evening, after the workers had left, Derek stopped by the house to check the mail. Inside the mailbox, he found a thick white envelope. It had no return address. It was simply addressed to the new owner. Derek opened the envelope and pulled out a typed letter. He stood on his new front porch, the sun setting behind the trees, and began to read. The letter started with a warm welcome to the neighborhood. But as Derek read down the page, his blood turned to ice. The letter said, 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out. The letter went on to criticize the renovations they were doing. And then it addressed their 3 children. The writer wrote, I see you have flooded 657 Boulevard with contractors so that you can destroy the house as it was supposed to be. TSK, TSK, TSK. You have children. I have seen them. So far, I think there are 3 that I have counted. Do you need to fill the house with the young blood? I requested. Once I know their names, I will call to them and draw them to me. It was signed. The watcher. Derek was paralyzed. He ran inside the empty house and locked the heavy front door. He called the local police immediately. The police arrived read the letter, and told Derek something incredibly unsettling. They told him to not tell anyone about the letter, not the contractors, and especially not the neighbors, because right now, everyone on that street was a suspect. 2 weeks later, Maria brought their children to the house to check on the paint colors. They played in the backyard for a few hours and then went back to their old home. The very next day, a second letter arrived in the mailbox of 657 Boulevard. This letter proved that the watcher was always looking. The writer now knew the children's actual names and even their secret nicknames that Maria had been calling out in the backyard. The letter read, "I am pleased to know your names now and the names of the young blood you have brought to me. Will the young blood play in the basement, or are they too afraid to go down there alone? I would be very afraid if I were them. It is far away from the rest of the house. If you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream." The psychological destruction of the Broaddus family had begun. They stopped bringing their children to the house. They stopped driving down the street. They felt the invisible eyes of the watcher on the back of their necks everywhere they went. They hired private investigators. They hired former FBI profilers. They set up hidden cameras in the trees facing the street. The police conducted deep background checks on every single neighbor surrounding the property. They looked for someone angry, someone disturbed, someone obsessed with the house. They interviewed the previous owners, who claimed they had never experienced anything like this in the 23 years they lived there. Despite a massive, highly publicized investigation, they found absolutely nothing. No fingerprints on the envelopes, no digital trail, no suspicious figures caught on the hidden cameras. The watcher was a ghost who knew exactly when they were there, what they were doing, and what they were saying. The Broaddus family never moved into their dream home. They were too terrified. The house sat completely empty for years, a dark, silent monument to a family's ruined life. They eventually sold the house in 2019 at a massive financial loss, just to escape the nightmare. To this day, the identity of the watcher remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. Was it a jealous neighbor sitting on their front porch with a pair of binoculars? Was it someone hiding inside the walls of the house itself? Or was it something far more sinister? We will probably never know. Over the past hour, we have taken a journey through the darkest corners of the place we call home. We have seen that the walls we build to protect ourselves are nothing more than an illusion. The hacker can bypass your locks. The stalker can pick them. The Phrogging is already inside. And the watcher doesn't even need to cross the threshold to tear your life apart. When you go to sleep tonight, you will lock your front door. You will check your windows. You will turn off the lights. But as you lie there in the dark, listening to the silence of your house, remember the stories you heard today. Remember that a locked door only stops an honest person. Remember that the glowing light on your camera might not be your own. And remember that the shadows in the corner of your room might be watching you back. Are you absolutely sure that you are alone? Thank you for surviving this 1-hour journey into the terrifying reality of home invasions. If you made it to the very end, leave a comment down below and tell me which of these 4 true stories terrified you the most. If you want to hear more deep dives into the dark, the unsolved, and the unknown, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell and give this video a like. Stay safe, check your locks, and I will see you in the next nightmare.